Hello everybody, thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to have Richard Pettrigrew here, who's talking about pluralism about beliefs.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming along. Okay, so here's the question I'm going to be interested in. Not quite sure where you'd place this question. It's maybe a bit epistemology. It could be philosophy of mind. I'm an epistemologist, so I'm sort of taking it from that angle. But in some ways, it's about how different sorts of mental state, particularly doxastic states, belief states, relate to one another. And sort of how many of these sorts of belief states you might want to posit. But so here's the sort of guiding question. How does belief relate to degrees of belief? So the idea is that, and I sort of apologize to people who've just been in the seminar before because I'm going to say things that will sound very familiar. There's sort of two traditions in epistemology. On the one hand, there's what people call traditional epistemology or mainstream epistemology, which has dealt really with beliefs, full beliefs. So the sort of doxastic state you either are in or you're not. You either believe that it's going to rain tomorrow or you don't believe it's going to rain tomorrow, and that's it. Those are the sorts of doxastic states that end up being becoming knowledge, the sort of things that you have that may or may not count as knowledge. So that's on the one hand mainstream or traditional epistemology. On the other hand, there's sort of formal epistemology or Bayesian epistemology, and that's been more concerned with a graded notion of beliefs. So a sort of a notion of belief where you can believe something to a greater or lesser extent. You can be more or less confident in something. And those degrees of belief typically get measured by numbers, measured numerically, usually by numbers between 0 and 1 inclusive. So 0 is the lowest possible degree of belief, 1 is the highest possible degree of belief. You might think of 1 as certainty, 0.5 as sort of indifference, something like that. So there seem to be two sorts of state, doxastic state, that people have been interested in epistemology, and the question is, how do they relate to one another? And there's two ways you could read this sort of question. You might be interested in a metaphysical sense. You might be interested in the question of what are those two sorts of, how are they related? Is it the case that you can reduce one of them to the other? Is one of them in some sense just nothing over and above certain features of the other? So is it the case that believing something is just no more than having a high degree of belief in it? So is there some sort of reductive or perhaps eliminative view there? That's the metaphysical reading of it. So it sort of asks the question of what the metaphysical status of the relationship is between those two. But there's also a normative reading of it which comes afterwards. Suppose you've decided there are just these two sorts of states. There are beliefs on the one hand, there are degrees of belief. Then the question is, well, in a rational agent, how do they relate to one another? How should they rationally relate to one another? If you have certain degrees of belief, what does that tell you about what you ought to have as your beliefs? And if you have certain beliefs, what does that tell you about what you ought to have as your degrees of belief? So I'm going to be interested in the second reading, the normative reading of the question. And just throughout, I'm going to assume that both sorts of states exist. In fact, the final conclusion, as the name suggests, is I'm going to claim there is actually rather more on one side of this divide than people have usually thought. I'm going to say there's a pluralism about states of full belief, but that's going to be some time coming. So here's an overview about it. So it's roughly going to track the history of the debate, actually. So I'm going to present what is in some ways just the natural or intuitive answer to the question, how do these things relate to one another? This sometimes gets called the Lockean, oops, oh gosh, shouldn't have done that, it's a smart board, yep, not. If I just do this, is it still going to record, okay? Yeah, is that all okay? It's not going to do something awful, okay. I won't touch it any longer. So, yeah, on the one hand, there's the Lockean, sometimes gets called the threshold account of the relationship between the two of them. This is, people claim they find this in the writings of John Locke, particularly the essay concerning human understanding. That's a historical question, but in any case, there's a natural account of how belief relates to degrees of belief that we'll talk about first. But that suffers from a particular problem that gets called the lottery paradox. I'll talk about that. There's a long period where people sort of tried to solve the lottery paradox, try to tweak the Lockean account so that they could then, so that it wouldn't suffer from the problems of the lottery paradox. And that didn't work. And in fact, it was shown 2 or 3 years ago that it would never work on the particular way that people were tending to do it. But then a year or so after that, a couple of different researchers proposed this alternative called the Humean or the Stability Thesis on belief, which again is a relationship between, a thesis about how these two sorts of states relate to one another. Again, Humean because people claim to find it in the writings of Hume. So I'll introduce that, and then what I would like to do is just talk about certain advantages and certain shortcomings of the Humean thesis. So really by this point here, we'll have a couple of accounts of the relationship on the table, and we'll sort of have a scorecard building up about what one account can do and what the other account can do and what they can't do. And one natural way to respond to that scorecard is to do what analytic philosophy has come to do often in these cases, is to sort of take the one that's got the highest score and say, we'll go with that one. And I want to say that actually in this situation, we're not forced down that route at all, that in fact what we should do is posit a larger number of belief states and say that they play different roles. Some play different roles better than others, and so they should be used for those sorts of purposes. Okay, so that's the thesis. This is not really a particularly technical talk. There are quite a lot of technical results in the background here, but I'm not going to talk about them. But there's going to be a tiny amount of notation just to really abbreviate things on the slides, but nothing particularly mathematical. So here's just the two pieces of notation. First of all, you've got a particular proposition X. I'll just use capital X, Y, Z, and so on as variables for different propositions, the objects of belief. I'm going to take propositions to be objects of beliefs rather than sentences. We're never going to get into questions about Hesperus and Phosphorus and so on, so we can just stick with propositions as the objects of belief at the moment. So no worries about that. So given a particular proposition X, I'm going to write bel X to claim that when the agent believes X, and I'm going to write P of X to denote the agent's degree of belief in that particular proposition. Degree of belief or credence, I'll sometimes say credence. There's a bunch of terms that are used for this: subjective probability, credence, degree of belief, partial belief, levels of confidence. They all mean pretty much the same thing. So we'll have Px to denote that, and that's going to be a number between 0 and 1 inclusive. Okay, so let's start with the Lockean thesis on belief. So it's the one that I already mentioned, the threshold account. And it basically just says what it is, or an agent should have belief in a particular proposition if and only if they have a sufficiently high degree of belief in that proposition. That is, if their degree of belief in that proposition is over some particular threshold. Now, how the threshold gets set is a sort of interesting question, but I'm not going to be interested in it here. But some people think it's a sort of contextually set number, the threshold. But in any case, once you've got a threshold, the Lockean thesis on belief says you should have a belief in a proposition X if and only if your degree of belief in it, P of X, is greater than that threshold. Okay, seems like the natural thing to say. So it makes it analogous to the predicate tall and the quantity degrees of height. So what is it to say that someone's tall? Well, it's just to say that they have a height over a particular threshold. Okay, so that's the Lockean account. So you find it in Locke, and you find this is Foley, who sort of talked about it quite a lot at the beginning. But it suffers from the following problem, the lottery paradox. So suppose, let's just suppose that our threshold for belief is 0.9. So the Lockean thesis for 0.9 says you should have a belief in a proposition if and only if your degree of belief in it is over 0.9, if it's over 90. If you're more than 90% confident, you should have a belief in the proposition, otherwise you shouldn't bother. Okay, that's a particular threshold. This sort of problem will arise whatever threshold you get. You just need to make the lottery bigger and bigger. So suppose there's now a fair 100 ticket lottery. Okay, so this is a lottery, it has 100 tickets, exactly one of those tickets will win, all of the other tickets will lose, each one of them has an equal chance of winning. And let's Ti, d sub I, is going to be the proposition that ticket I will lose. Okay. So what's your probability that ticket I will lose for any one of these? Well, it's just 99 over 100, okay? Because it will lose. That proposition will be true in all cases other than the case in which it wins, which is 1 over 100. So your probability that for each of the tickets that it will lose was 99 over 100. That's clearly greater than your threshold. So by the threshold account, you'd better have a belief in that proposition. Okay, so you should believe that proposition. You should believe for each individual ticket, you should believe of it that that ticket will lose. And that sounds kind of okay at the moment. But notice the other thing. First of all, notice that you believe your probability for the negation of the conjunction of all of those propositions will be 1. You're certain that it's not true that ticket 1 loses, and ticket 2 loses, and ticket 3 loses, and ticket 4 loses, up to ticket 100 loses. Well, because one of them's got to win, so you can be certain that it's not the case that they will all lose. Okay, so then you'd better believe that proposition. What's more, you should also have, this is just the inverse of this really, you should, oh for goodness sake, unable to learn. You should also have a degree of belief 0 in the conjunction of all of these. You should have 0 credence that ticket 1 will lose, and ticket 2 will lose, and ticket 3 will lose, and so on. So you shouldn't have a belief in that proposition. So that means you should believe the negation of all these things, and you should not believe the conjunction here. So what's the upshot of this? Well, that means that you believed each ticket will lose, but you don't believe the conjunction of all the propositions that about the tickets losing. That means that your beliefs don't have a property that you would initially think they should have. Namely, that if you believe one proposition and you also believe another proposition, then you should believe the conjunction of the two of them. That seems a natural thing to believe, right? If you believe that Alaska is in the United States and you believe that North Dakota is in the United States, then you should believe that Alaska and North Dakota are in the United States. That seems like a very plausible principle of belief. I believe X and I believe Y, I should believe the conjunction X and Y. But it turns out on the Lockean thesis or the threshold thesis, that's not going to be the case. I believe each of the tickets will lose, but I don't believe that all of them will lose. What's more, I in fact believe that it's not the case that all of them will lose. But that proposition there, that they won't all lose, is inconsistent with the collection of all the propositions that the tickets will lose. So the Lockean thesis has this very peculiar conclusion that rational belief is not closed under conjunction. If you believe in X and you believe Y, then there's no guarantee that you will believe X and Y. And what's more, rational belief is not necessarily logically coherent. It can be rational, according to the threshold view, to have a bunch of beliefs, all of which could never be true together. And that seems a very odd situation, because belief, you think of, is your commitment to how the world is. If I say, I believe certain things, I'm committing to the world being that way. But if I have a bunch of beliefs, all of which are my commitments to how the world are, but they can't all be true together, that means they can't possibly be a commitment to how the world is, because I know that the world couldn't possibly be that way. So something rather strange about the Lockean thesis in that respect. Some people have just bitten the bullet and said, okay, this is an interesting thing we've learned about beliefs, and some people have thought this is decisive against the Lockean thesis. So what are the alternatives? So, as I said, there were sort of endless attempts to fix this view, and they all proved problematic until a particular theory was sort of independently come up by Horacio R. Lacosta and Arthur Paul Peterson on the one hand, and Hannes Leitgeb on the other hand. I'm going to be presenting it in the way that Leitgeb presents it, but they're to all intents and purposes exactly the same theory. There are small tweaks here and there that are slightly different, but all the issues that I bring up about them are going to be true of both theories. The technical details don't make any difference. So the Humean thesis about belief, sometimes gets called the stability thesis about belief, says the following thing. The problem with the Lockean thesis was that it was too lenient. It let in too many beliefs. And that was how you ended up letting in so many beliefs that in some cases they were inconsistent. You've got to be a lot more demanding of a proposition before it gets to be a belief. And the demand that you should make on it is the following. It's not just enough for a proposition to be believed that you have a high degree of belief in it. It's got to be, moreover, that that high degree of belief will remain high regardless of what new evidence you get, with a small qualification to that. But the idea is, at least initially, if I have a particularly high degree of belief in a proposition, that's not enough for it to be a belief. It's also got to be the case that whatever I then go on to learn, my degree of belief in that proposition will remain high. So it's stably high. Sometimes gets called resilient to new evidence. It's high and it's going to continue to be above that threshold regardless of the new evidence I get. Now that's not strictly what it says, because of course it couldn't be the case that it's going to be resilient under any new evidence I get, because some of my new evidence might just tell me that it's false, for sure, you know. So what it really says is you should have a belief in a particular proposition X if your degree of belief in it is high, and it remains high when you conditionalize, when you update, when you obtain new evidence that you thought was doxastically possible, that you hadn't ruled out by your beliefs. So what does what does it mean for something to be doxastically possible? It just means that you don't believe its negation. Okay? So it's doxastically possible to me that it will be sunny tomorrow because I don't believe that it won't be sunny tomorrow. Okay, that's all that means. So something's doxastically possible if it's true in one of the possible worlds that you haven't ruled out by having your beliefs. So this says you should believe something if and only if you have a high probability in it, and that probability remains high regardless of what evidence you get, so long as that evidence was doxastically possible for you. That part, I mean, that part's not going to be hugely important. And in fact, there's quite a lot about the formalism that's not really going to be enormously important. I'll just tell you certain features that this account ends up having and why they're problematic. Okay, so an agent believes something if and only if she has sufficiently high credence in proposition and it remains sufficiently high under conditioning on doxastically possible evidence. Okay, interest of time, I'll go through this very, very quickly. Essentially, this slide says this account doesn't suffer from the lottery paradox. So there isn't a lottery paradox for it. And what happens really is, you might think, well, what gives in the lottery paradox? Why doesn't it do it? Essentially what happens is you don't end up believing each of the propositions about the tickets losing. So you don't believe ticket 1 will lose. You don't believe ticket 2 will lose. You don't believe you just don't have any of those beliefs. So it's really restrictive on beliefs. It cuts down the number of beliefs that you have. So you still believe that one of the tickets will win. Well, of course you do. You're certain of that. That's the setup of the lottery. But you don't believe of each ticket that it will lose. Okay, so yeah. And in fact, there's something stronger than this, and this is one of the nicest features of the Humean account of belief, is that rational belief is closed under conjunction. So if you believe A and you believe B, then you will believe A and B. And what's more, that rational belief is always going to be logically coherent. So as long as you satisfy this, you can guarantee that your beliefs will be logically consistent. So that's one of these sort of technical results that's in the background here, that both Arlo, Costa, and Pedersen and also Lightgate prove. Okay. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about some advantages of this, or supposed advantages of this account, and then some shortcomings of it. I'll talk about certain supposed advantages here, and then I'll actually claim that they're not really advantages they're supposed to be. And then I'll talk about these, which are definitely shortcomings of it and are actually advantages of the Lockean account. And then I want to talk about this final one, moral rule of belief, which is meant to be a problem for both of them, Lockean and Humean. And at the end, we're going to say that these suggest to us we should have a certain sort of pluralism about belief states. So the thought is that I'm sure there are others that people can think of, but there are sort of three big roles that beliefs play in our lives. One of them is pragmatic, that is, we use our beliefs to guide our action. We decide what to do on the basis of what we believe. There's epistemic roles. We use beliefs also to represent how the world is. Obviously, those roles are connected. You use them to guide action because you think they represent the world. But there's those sorts of roles. And then there's this role, which is maybe not initially so obvious, I'll talk about a bit at the end, where belief is used as the sort of thing that can ground your ascription of blame to a person. In a situation where you think someone's done something wrong, the norms that guide whether or not you should blame a person for doing it, some people think are determined by whether or not you believe they're guilty. Okay, we'll come to that later. So here's an argument that Lightgape gives, or a claim that Lightgape makes about why you might want the Humean account of belief over the Lockean account of belief. So you might just be on board already, because you might just think, well, look, Lockean account of belief gave that lottery paradox, and that was dreadful. So anything that doesn't have that is better, and so he doesn't even have to convince you that it's good. But here's his account anyway. Here's his argument why the Humean account seems good. So he thinks that one of the things that we want beliefs to do is to guide extended actions. Okay, and I think there's an important point in this, because often when people talk about pragmatic role of beliefs, they talk about sort of decision theory and making decisions on the basis of your subjective probabilities. And usually in those cases, they're talking about immediate action, actions that you decide at this point and then you perform the action there and then, and it's done instantaneously. So things like choosing what to order on a restaurant menu, deciding whether to place a particular bet. They don't take any time really, or not any significant amount of time to perform them, just do them there and then. But there's another class of actions that take you a while to perform, that aren't talked about nearly so much in decision theory, and Lightgape thinks that beliefs are going to become important in those. Okay, so here's his example, his spritzer example. So suppose I'm thirsty, and at T1, the earlier time, I believe there's a spritzer in the fridge, so I walk to it. That's going to take some time. Let's say I'm on the second story of my house and the fridge is on the first story of my house. So I walk to the fridge and I open it at the later time T2. So it's an extended action, starts at T1, finishes at T2. So Lightgape says, well, suppose here's a natural account of what motivates or guides or justifies that action. I believe there's a spritzer in the fridge. I'm thirsty, therefore I desire a drink, and a spritzer will do the job. Therefore, I decide to walk to the fridge and pick up the spritzer and drink it. But he thinks that wouldn't provide a good account of me starting the action and moving it all the way through to completion unless the belief I have is constant throughout the entire duration of the action, from T1 through to T2. So if I want a sort of belief that could guide that sort of action, it's got to be the sort of belief that will remain constant over the course of the action that I carry out. But of course, things will happen to me between T1 and T2. I'll walk down the stairs, I'll look at my phone, I'll bump into someone in the hallway. Things will happen to me. And if it were the case that that belief weren't particularly resilient, if I could lose it quite easily between T1 and T2, then it wouldn't be a good basis for the extended action that I need to carry out. So he claims what you want as a sort of belief, as a sort of state that could justify extended action, is a belief that was resilient in some way to the sorts of things that could happen to you between T1 and T2. And the one that he focuses on is new evidence that you could get. So between T1 and T2, as I walk down the stairs, walk along the hall, open the door to the kitchen, I'll get all sorts of new evidence, because I'll see things all around me, I might look at my phone, I might speak to somebody, all sorts of new evidence will come in. If it were the case that you had this belief, but it was very easy for new evidence to knock out that belief, then it wouldn't be good as a motivation or a guide to extended action. So he thinks that it's a good feature, positive feature of the Humean account, that it doesn't allow beliefs to get undermined by the sort of evidence that you might get during the course of an extended action. Because if it were, then if it could get undermined in that way, it wouldn't be the sort of thing that could justify or motivate an extended action. So he thinks this is a tick on the scorecard for the Humean, because it does, the Humean beliefs don't get undermined by doxastically possible evidence that you might acquire. Lockean beliefs do, so Lockean beliefs aren't the sort of things that could motivate extended action. So that's bad for Lockean beliefs. There's a bit of a problem with this though, because there's not the sort of thing that could happen to you between starting off here at T1 and walking to the kitchen at T2. There are other sorts of things that could happen to you that could knock out your belief. It's not just that you might acquire new evidence. You might consider a finer grained range of possibilities. So suppose at the start of the action, all I consider as the possibilities are, is this two propositions. Is the spritzer in the spritzer's in the fridge, and the spritzer's not in the fridge. So it's a very coarse graining of all the possibilities. But that's fine, because all I need to know at the start of my action is that the spritzer's in the fridge. I don't need to know where in the fridge it is at the start of my action, because I've got 5 minutes of walking down and getting to the kitchen. I don't need to know that at the start. So I only consider this coarse graining of the possibilities. But as I get to the fridge, it's going to become important to know whether it's on the top or the bottom, because I'm going to reach up to the top, I'm going to reach down to the bottom, depends where I'm going to look first, and so on. I'm going to start fine graining the possibilities. So I might now start considering other possibilities. I might start considering spritzers in the top of the fridge, spritzers in the bottom of the fridge. That is, I take this coarse-grained possibility and I split it in two, essentially. And it turns out this is really problematic for the Humean account of belief. Because, and this is, I think, probably the major flaw in the Humean account of belief, it's what you believe is sensitive to the grain of the possibilities that you consider on the Humean account. So to see it, let's just look at this example. Suppose I've got spritzer, at the start of the action, I've just got spritzer in the fridge, spritzer not in the fridge. Those are the only two possibilities I consider. That's my graining of the whole world. And I have credence of 0.7 in the first one, 0.3 in the bottom one, and my threshold, let's say, is 0.6. Then it would be fine for me to have the Humean belief that the spritzer's in the fridge. That's no problem. It's resiliently high. Relative to all the doxastic possibilities I'm considering at the moment, it will remain high, conditioning on any of those possibilities. But now suppose I move to this situation as I get towards the fridge, I'm just about to open it, I start considering more fine-grained possibilities, top of the fridge or bottom of the fridge. I suppose basically I just split my credence that the spritzer's in the fridge in half. Give half of it to the possibility it's in the top of the fridge, half of it to the possibility it's in the bottom of the fridge. Then suddenly it turns out in that second situation, it's now impermissible for me to have the Humean belief that the spritzer's in the fridge. And really the reason is, I mean, we can look at the technicalities if people are interested in, but the reason is, you can see reasonably easily. Remember what the Humean account says. It says you believe something if you've got a high degree of belief in it, and that degree of belief remains high regardless of what doxastic possibilities you condition on. What I've done in between T1 and T2 is I've widened out the range of doxastic possibilities that there are. And so it's now much more demanding. The Humean condition on having a belief is much more demanding in that situation, because there are now new propositions that my credence in spritz in the fridge must remain high when I condition on. So that's the real problem. You can start off with a belief in a proposition and then just fine-grain that proposition a little bit. Just split it in half, for instance. Proposition spritzers in the fridge into bottom of fridge or top of fridge. And just by doing that, you've acquired no new evidence, you've not changed any of your degrees of belief in the original propositions. That all just remains the same, but nonetheless you lose the belief. And that seems like a very, very odd component of that. But what's more, it means that actually Humean beliefs aren't all that great for extended action. Because if I need to keep the belief all the way throughout the action, but it's vulnerable to me fine-graining the possibilities too much, then I might lose it just towards the end of the action as I start fine-graining the possibilities. So that's the problem. So it looks like the scorecard is now balanced up a little bit more. So sure, it's the case that the Lockean belief, a Lockean belief can be undermined by getting in new evidence, and the Humean one can't, but the Lockean one can't be undermined by fine-graining down the possibilities that I consider, whereas the Humean one can. Okay. Maybe skip this. Essentially, this looks much more horrible than it is. So suppose you've got these two states, beliefs on the one hand, degrees of belief on the other hand, and you're wanting to use them to justify actions that you're wanting to perform. Turns out on the degrees of belief side, we've got a really good theory of how that works. It's called decision theory, developed in the 20s and 30s, now spectacularly sophisticated, tells you how you should choose what action to perform out of a range of actions given what your probabilities are and what your utilities are. It's excellent. But we don't have anything equivalent on the belief side, or at least we have something very, very crude on the belief side, which is something like, well, if I believe X and I believe, if I want X and I believe that M is a means to X, then I should do M. Okay, that's the sort of standard desire belief, very, very crude desire belief model. But it's way too crude to account for most decisions. So there's a question about, is there any sort of decision theory that you could give on the belief side that would sort of work in harmony with the decision theory that we've got on the degree of belief side? And there's an interesting question, and there's been some work done on that. But what Lightgabe claims is that there are certain things that we, if you take the Humean account of belief, there are certain situations in which you can make decisions just based on your beliefs that will be in harmony with the decisions that would have been justified by your degrees of belief. Now, and it's all true. It's true. This is an advantage. What he doesn't note is that this is also true for the Lockean thesis on belief. So exactly the same advantage accrues to the Lockean thesis and the Humean thesis. But I won't spend any longer on that. That sort of just keeps the scorecard pretty even. Assertion. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about this briefly. So another claim that Lightgabe makes about the Humean account of belief is that it's very good at justifying assertion. Okay. So there's sort of been a lot of discussion recently about what the norm of assertion is, and people say that norm of assertion might be you should assert something if and only if you know it. Sorry, not if and only if, but only if you know it. But Lightgabe considers a slightly weaker version of that you should assert something only if you believe it. And so he thinks that the sort of thing that belief can do is give you a grounding or a warrant for making particular assertions. And there's particularly going to be cases of assertion where you're making an assertion to give someone some information that they might then use to perform one of these extended actions. So suppose it's not me who's thirsty, it's you who's thirsty. But it's me who has the belief that the spritzer is in the fridge. And so what I do is I tell you that, I assert that, and you hear it. So you walk to the fridge and open it at T2. Again, you might think, well, you could only do that, or it could only be used for that purpose if the belief that I try to convey to you, the belief that I have that I then base my assertion on, is something that's resilient, that it's stable, or it's going to be high and remain high regardless of what you go on to learn in the course of your walking towards the fridge, because I don't want to give you, try to give you some information where my belief in it is actually very vulnerable to new information that you get as you walk towards the fridge. So Lightgabe thinks that, again, that sort of assertions in that sort of situation can only be justified or warranted on the basis of Humean beliefs. But there's a bit of a problem here, because essentially what you think you're doing there is I make the assertion that the spritzer's in the fridge, and what I'm trying to do is get you to take that on as one of your beliefs on the basis of my testimony. Because if you take it on as one of your beliefs and you take it on as a resilient belief, then it will be the sort of thing that can ground your action of walking towards the fridge. But the problem is that just you saying that to me doesn't tell me that I should be able to take on that belief of yours as a belief of mine. So just knowing that you believe something or have a Humean belief in something doesn't mean that I should take it on, because I might be graining the possibilities much more finely than you're graining them. So you might have just considered these two possibilities, but I might have considered all of these possibilities. And if you tell me that you have this belief, the spritzer's in the fridge, but I've considered these, then I shouldn't take it on that belief as one of my beliefs, because for me it isn't resilient to new evidence that you get on the way. So that seems to be a bit of a problem. Okay, so that's the two cases of the pragmatic rule of belief that, like Gabe thinks, the Humean account does a really good job of playing those roles, but it turns out actually their goodness is somewhat mitigated. Now I want to say some things that the Lockean thesis is really good at, and the Humean thesis is not really so good at all. This is not, I should say, as we'll see at the end, because I'm a fan of the Lockean thesis, and the point of this is to be pluralistic. So the purpose of this section is not to beat up on the Humean thesis, but to circumscribe what it might be good at. And the conclusion at the end is going to be, sure, it's good at certain things, and it should be used for those things, but you should have other sorts of belief states, and they should be used for the other things that Humean beliefs aren't good at. Okay, so here's a paradox about beliefs. So we've all got some store of beliefs. Okay, let's sort of idealize vastly and assume that there's just some set of propositions. For each one of us, there's some set of propositions that are the propositions that we believe. But it's vast, it's enormous, and they've all been acquired in various ways, and you can't remember how you've acquired some of them, and so on. So you naturally, as a sort of good fallibilist, believe that some of those beliefs will be false. So in that store of beliefs that you have is included the belief, some of my beliefs are false. Now the problem with that is that means you've now got an inconsistent set of beliefs. Okay, they can't all be true together. It can't be the case that each one of your beliefs is true and also the belief, some of my beliefs are false, is also true. So this gets called the Preface Paradox because it's, so David Mackinson introduces it as by saying that often at the start of books in the preface people say, there's lots of claims in this book, so I've tried to make them as correct as possible, but some of them will be false. And notes that that's a very peculiar thing to do, to both assert everything within a book and also assert that some of those things are false, because that's inconsistent. But in any case, this seems to be true of our beliefs. But at the same time, that seems exactly right, that we should have all of these beliefs, because in each case, they're supported by our evidence. Okay? So each belief, well, let's just assume, it's quite possible that we all have beliefs that are not supported by our evidence, but let's assume that we've been really good as cognizers throughout our lives. In each case, each belief that we have is supported by our evidence. But it's also supported by our evidence that, in the past we've been wrong about things. We've watched other people be wrong about things. We don't think we're anything special. So we've got good evidence that we're also fallible. So every belief, both the individual sort of first order beliefs and that second order belief about the falsity of my first order beliefs, all of those are supported by evidence. But it turns out it's not possible for all of those beliefs to be Humean beliefs. Because, as I said before, you can't have a set of Humean beliefs that are logically inconsistent. Humean beliefs are always logically consistent. So there seems to be this tension between an evidentialist account of rational belief and the Humean account on the other hand. The evidentialist account is rational to have your belief if and only if it's the belief supported by the evidence. Each one of my beliefs in the Preface Paradox is supported by my evidence, but the Humean account says that they can't all be my beliefs. And also, the Humean belief, what this highlights really is that the Humean thesis is incompatible with a certain sort of natural principle for beliefs, a sort of natural localism about what it means for a belief to be rational. Which I think is what the evidentialist is getting at, that a set of beliefs is rational if and only if each one of them is supported by the evidence relative to that belief. So in order to find out whether your belief in a particular proposition is rational or not, I shouldn't have to look at your beliefs in other propositions. I should just have to look at your evidence base and ask, does that evidence base support that particular belief? But on the Humean account, that's exactly not what happens. To find out whether I have a belief or not, you have to look elsewhere at all my other beliefs to see whether this belief is the sort of thing that would be resilient under learning those other beliefs, learning those other propositions. So yeah, so Humean thesis sort of cuts against locality principle. Also, the Lockean thesis doesn't. So the Lockean thesis is sort of, you can think of as the perfect evidentialist thesis. Because suppose you're, I mean, you don't have to be a Williamsonian about these things, but suppose you're Williamsonian and you think there's such a thing as an evidential probability function. You know, a probability function that gives you for each proposition the extent to which your evidence supports that proposition. Then in that sort of case, you can just use that probability function, apply that to the Lockean account to give all of your beliefs. And then you will have something that precisely satisfies this. You'll have a belief just in case your evidential probability for that proposition is sufficiently high. And then you'll get the Preface Paradox case. So yeah, the Humean account doesn't seem to play so nicely with our intuitive notion of how evidence relates to rationality of belief. Okay, maybe go through this quite quickly as well. So there's been quite a lot of interest recently. This is sort of something I've been working on mainly for the last 5 years or so, but interest in other quarters as well, in epistemic utility. So this is the idea that doxastic states, like beliefs, are the sorts of things that can be better or worse. So in the case of belief, it's kind of straightforward. A belief's better if it's true and worse if it's false. In fact, those are the only two things it can be. And so you just give a certain epistemic utility to having a true belief. Let's call that R. That's going to be a positive number. And a certain epistemic utility to having a false belief. That's going to be minus W, where W is a positive number. So minus W is a negative number. And so you might think, okay, so think of this in some ways as a sort of precise version of William James's stuff about the will to believe, where he says, you know, you're interested in there's two possibilities that are available when you come to have a belief. You might get it right and that'll be really good for you, but you might get it wrong and that might be really bad for you. But if you'd stuck still, kind of be neutral. So you sort of take a risk by having a belief. You take a risk because it could be that it ends up being false and that will be worse for you than if you just stuck with nothing at all. But also it gives you the possibility of getting something good. Okay, and so you might think what we do is we decide for each proposition whether we should believe it or not. And the way we decide is we ask, what's its expected epistemic utility, calculated in this way. So if I've got high probability in it, then I give a lot more weight to that outcome where it ends up being true than to the one where it ends up being false. And if it's sufficiently high, then it might tip over into being something that I want to believe. Now it turns out, this is a very straightforward sort of just little bit of algebra calculation. It's sort of originally shown by Hempel in a much ignored later section of this famous paper on the deductive nomological method. Everybody reads the first couple of sections and it's kind of the classic text on the deductive nomological method. But actually the second half is just as interesting, and he shows here that essentially if you take that approach, you get out a version of the Lockean thesis. So basically you take how much you value getting a true belief, how much you disvalue getting a false belief, and you can cook that up into a threshold such that you should have, believing a particular proposition has positive expected epistemic utility if and only if your probability for that proposition is greater than that threshold. So, and that sort of makes sense in some ways. You know, if you really, really disvalue having a false belief, you think that'd be dreadful, and you kind of you think it'd be quite good to have a true belief, but not so much, then it will take a lot of probability for you to think that it's worth having the belief. Okay, so that's that. In any case, this ends up giving a Lockean account. So the upshot of this really is, on the Humean account, if you specify the Humean account, your beliefs are not maximizing expected epistemic utility. So in that sense, they seem to be irrational. So it's sort of interesting. There's sort of two sides to accounts of rationality in epistemology. There's the evidentialist account and then the kind of veritist account. Evidentialists think that rationality is all about sort of matching with the evidence. Veritists think that rationality is all about doing things that are conducive to being true. And it turns out that on both of them, evidentialist or, well, I put it as accuracy, but you could put it as veritist, both of them lead you to a Lockean account of belief. Okay, final sort of bit of beating up, and this is actually beating up on both accounts. So Lara Bushak has this, makes the following point. She bases it on a certain observation that's made about in legal theory. And the observation is that we don't allow law courts to convict on the basis of purely statistical evidence. So here's the two examples. First example, they're both cases in which someone gets hit by a bus. They get hit from behind, so they don't see the bus, so they don't know what the bus company was that was liable for, or whose bus it was hit them. But they want to sue them, but they don't know which one it was. But they do know that 90% of the buses in their neighborhood are run by bus company A, and 10% are run by bus company B. So they've got a 90% confidence that the bus that hit them was bus company A's bus. That's pretty high. That's a pretty high degree of belief. You can make it as high as you like. Say 99% of buses in your area are run by bus A and 1% run by bus B. Then you've got really high credence that it was bus company A that hit you. But nonetheless, courts won't allow you to convict bus company A on the basis of that because it's purely statistical evidence. Consider the second scenario. Same thing, someone hits you, but this time you don't have any statistical evidence. Instead, you have eyewitness evidence. So the eyewitness saw the bus company name on the side of it. But let's say the eyewitness, it was a kind of rainy night, it was dark, the eyewitness doesn't have terribly good vision. Let's say on tests afterwards, they were about 75, 80% reliable at recognizing something at that distance. So now you've got about 75, 80% confidence that it was bus company A that hit you on the basis of this eyewitness evidence. It turns out that courts will allow you to convict on the basis of that. The eyewitness testimony will be permitted, but pure statistical evidence won't be permitted on its own. Okay, so that's all about the legal case. You might think, what's the relevance of that to epistemology? The idea is supposed to be, we have similar intuitions about beliefs. You should think, according to Bushak, that it's permissible for you to believe that bus company A is guilty in the second case when you've got the eyewitness evidence, but it's not permissible for you to believe that bus company A was guilty in the first case where you've just got the statistical evidence. Now, if that's the case, that really spells trouble for the Lockean thesis and the Humean thesis, because it now turns out that in order to know whether or not you're allowed to believe something, it's not just enough to know how high your degree of belief is, or even how high it is conditional on certain other things. You also have to know what sort of evidence it is that justifies that you have in favor of that belief. So, I mean, this is I've kind of tried to cook up something that was is a sort of precise version of what Bushak's suggesting, but that's not particularly relevant. The crucial thing is that neither the Lockean account nor the Humean account will give you the right sorts of beliefs that you could use in ascriptions of blame in moral situations, according to this. So the thought is there's a different sort of belief state that we would need, or at least belief states that satisfy these properties are not going to, the Lockean or the Humean accounts, are not going to be the right sort of thing. Okay, so how do you respond to all of this? I'll just wrap up this slide then. How do you respond to all of this? So you start off with the Lockean account. Lottery paradox seems to really hit that hard. Seems to have very unintuitive consequences. The Humean account rides to the rescue and seems like it's got all these nice features, but actually it turns out it hasn't got quite as many nice features as you originally think. And what's more, it doesn't do nearly so well in the epistemic role of belief, namely in sort of matching with evidence or getting you at the truth. And neither of them do any good when it comes to being the sort of state that could warrant ascriptions of moral blame, which is clearly going to be an important role for beliefs to play. So how do you? So one response to this might be to, like I said at the start, do a scorecard system and sort of say, well, look, these are really nice things, and these are the things we want most, and one of these accounts gets that more than the other, and so that must be the account of belief. It must be that that's the right account of belief. But this doesn't seem to be a case to me where that sort of thing's necessary. And the sorts of cases we're used to where we use that sort of scorecard system are things like metaphysical theories, sort of cost-benefit analysis of metaphysical theories. Okay, so I think that possible worlds are real because it turns out it unifies everything. It gives me an account of propositions and modal statements and counterfactuals and chance. It gives me everything I need. That's why people typically use that sort of cost-benefit analysis to give you a situation. But they use it in a situation where you've got to plump for one or the other. You can't say two different conflicting metaphysical theories are correct. But this doesn't seem to be such a situation. It doesn't seem that there's any restriction on us having just one sort of categorical doxastic state, one sort of on-off belief state. We could have belief 1, belief 2, belief 3. And they could play different roles in our mental lives. And in fact, when you look at why we end up positing beliefs in the first place, that seems like exactly the sort of thing we do. Why do we bother positing beliefs when we've already got degrees of belief which are much more fine-grained, give you much more information, and seem to be able to do a lot more, like the decision theory is incredibly well developed, and so is the rules for reasoning with it? Well, the usual reason we posit them is because it's computationally very intractable to use probabilities and degrees of belief all the time to do all of your reasoning. And it turns out people are very bad at reasoning with probabilities in a lot of cases. So you often posit beliefs in order to explain how we can do faster and more computationally feasible reasoning and decision making. But if that's our reason for doing it, this is we're sort of positing them when to fill a need that we have in our theorizing about the mind, why stick with one? If it turns out there's a bunch of roles that we need categorical doxastic states to play, and we've sort of shown as a result of this that you can't get a single sort of categorical doxastic state to play all of them, then why not suppose that there are more? Why not suppose that there's a doxastic state that supports certain sorts of extended action, one that supports non-extended action, one that licenses assertion, one to use in reasoning, one that reflects evidence, one that answers to accuracy considerations, and one that supports moral ascriptions of blame. So that's the proposal, that we sort of, that in fact this sort of drive to find a single account of belief such that it's going to play all of the roles is, anyway, we've sort of shown that it's impossible to find something that plays all of the roles, and moreover it was sort of wasn't something that we really should have been doing in the first place, because there was no restriction on how many of these things we ended up positing. Okay, thanks very much.